Hello, good morning, welcome. I am Samuel Trapp. This is International Flavor. You are listening to Damn Radio. I am pre-recording this show the evening of the 10th of May because I shall be traveling in the morning. Lots of interesting news to go over. I only say that so you don't phone in on today's program. A lot of stuff went on, a lot of interesting events in the world. I spent some time watching Solovyov, which, I was really worried about the May Day. I'm worried. I suppose that's not the right word to say. I was wondering, watching with interest whether or not the May Day, it's not May Day. May Day is the 1st of May. Victory Day parades in Moscow would be attacked by the Ukrainians. They were not, and that's actually a positive set of events that didn't happen. However, they did attack in other locations. There were protests around America also over Israel and tax dollars. I don't know if you've seen any of that I wanted to get to. There was a condition that Putin put for speaking with Zelensky. I watched Solovyov on Sunday night, the Sunday show, and it comes out early in the afternoon actually, and so I had a chance to watch it earlier in the day. And Solovyov did for Victory Day, he did a 2-3 day tour around the front, and he toured with I forget the nomenclature of the brigade that he was traveling with, but he traveled with a brigade that he was with them for, at least overnight. He spent a lot of time with them and lots of show, and they were talking about some drone activity, air defense. The commander spent a lot of time with them. They went out and saw the launch of a few drones. They saw the knocking down of some Ukrainian drones because they have anti-drone forces as well. They had a couple of pretty interesting interviews that went on, and if these things are really that accurate, it was, I tell you what, the Russians are they're getting a lot of experience from this, a lot of mileage out of it as well, and they are learning some things. They were talking about how this particular unit had discovered how to set up their drones with night vision, because shooting other drones at night is quite difficult, if the drones are going out at night. And drones can't normally see other drones, but apparently one of the guys in their unit discovered some kind of a frequency that shows how to spot a certain temperature that is only available on the drone itself, and they can see these other drones and they can pinpoint them in the air, and then they send them out and they shoot them down. They've been taking them down for a little while with these anti-drone forces, and so it was a pretty interesting report actually, and it only lasted about 30 minutes, 45 maybe, that he went through, but there was quite a lot of content in there, and he drove around with them and showed quite a bit of content on the anti-drone forces. And then the rest of the show, he was arguing with he got into a pretty heated argument with somebody over Armenia and what is going on in Armenia. And if you remember last week, I shared a story with you about the Armenian president, prime minister, whoever he was, Pashinyan, I can't remember, I think is his name, but he met with Putin a little while ago. And maybe a week ago, and Putin was saying, that there are some things that are pretty positive, but they're still trying to get into European Union as well. And there was some heated argument over that and what Armenia needs to be doing. I want to study up on it a little bit more, but that was and give you some more events from there, because that was heated. And the basics were that they aren't being truthful with the electorate in Armenia, and Solovyov's point was, well, they don't get to elect anyway, just like this is the exact way that Moldova was converted over to the EU, and they're doing the same all over the southern border of Russia as well. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, all of those former Soviet republics that they're twisting, doing the exact same thing they did in Moldova, that they've done in places like Serbia, Bulgaria, all of those places, to turn them completely anti-Russia, just like the rest of Europe. And he made no bones about it that we're fighting where, they don't even know what Victory Day is in America. They don't have any understanding of what it is. And partially that's true. I mean, what do we celebrate around World War II? Whether or not it, we really don't. And so the Russians, though, it's a big deal to them. And so there's Russia. Let's see, there were some violated the ceasefire. There's some news that says the ceasefire was violated a total of 16,000 times. So the Victory Day truce announced by Russia to mark the 81st anniversary of the end of World War II, man, it just seems like yesterday that we were talking about the 80th anniversary and everybody getting invited. And there was some talk about perhaps an American going over there. And this year Fico went, but that was it, nobody else. And he's been ostracized. Mertz says he's going to have some words for him. But anyway, the Victory Day truce of the 81st anniversary, the truce was expiring on Sunday. But Moscow agreed to extend it for 2 more days. In a statement on Sunday, the Defense Ministry said the Ukrainian forces carried out drone and artillery strikes in Crimea, the Belgorod region, Kursk, Kaluga, Rostov region, Krasnodar. In Belgorod alone, 5 civilians, including a teenager, were injured in Ukrainian drone attacks, according to Regional Governor Vyacheslav Gladkov. And Ukrainian troops carried out 676 strikes against Russian positions using artillery, multiple launch rocket systems, mortars, and tanks. Kiev launched 6,331 drones and 8 assaults on Russian positions. In total, the Russian Ministry of Defense recorded 16,071 ceasefire violations by Kiev since Friday. And under these circumstances, Russian troops responded symmetrically by targeting firing positions, drone launch sites, and command centers. Russian forces strictly observed the ceasefire regime and stayed at the previously occupied lines and positions. And throughout the conflict, Moscow declared temporary truces during major religious and national holidays last month. Russia talked about and announced an Easter ceasefire, which the defense ministry said was violated by the Ukrainian forces more than 6,500 times in 32 hours. And Ukrainian leader, the Green Goblin, Vladimir Zelensky, issued several threats ahead of Victory Day, prompting Moscow to warn its foreign partners about possible consequences. The Russian Defense Ministry warned that retaliatory strikes on central Kiev would be carried out if attempts were made to disrupt Victory Day in Moscow, and urged residents and diplomats to leave the Ukraine capital in advance of that. President Putin said the warning reached Washington and did contribute to Trump's extended ceasefire initiative, but he also said that the globalist Western elites are still waging war against Russia using Ukraine as proxies, and the conflict is heading toward its end. I was going to read for you when I was trying to find the version where I wouldn't have to translate it myself for Putin's Victory Day speech, and I want to share that with you, and I will this week, but I didn't have it prepared for today. And, you know, the talk of Armenia, I tell you what, there's so much going on, and I apologize for bouncing around a little bit, but Moscow expects explanations from Yerevan over Zelensky's statements, and the Ukrainian leader's remarks during his visit to Armenia were another veiled threat. And so Russia expected the Armenian leadership to explain the lack of a reaction to the anti-Russia statements made by Vladimir Zelensky during his recent visit to Yerevan, said Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov. Providing a venue for such rhetoric goes against the spirit of partnership between the two nations. So Zelensky was in Yerevan this week for a 2-day summit on the European Political Community, an EU-led intergovernmental group launched in 2022. He asked for more military and financial assistance from the West and claimed that Moscow was scared that Ukrainian drones may buzz Red Square ahead of Victory Day celebrations. The Russian Defense Ministry warned that if Ukraine attempted to disrupt festivities, a major retaliatory strike would follow. But Peskov said we would surely expect some explanations from Armenia, and he pointed to a lack of any attempt to balance Zelensky's statements on the part of Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, who was hosting the summit. Moscow does not understand why anti-Russian statements are coming from Armenia. And on Thursday, the Russian Foreign Ministry summoned the Armenian ambassador in Moscow to protest opening the floor for Zelensky's terrorist threats. Peskov maintained that Yerevan has a sovereign right to define its foreign policy and host any summits it wants, but added that Moscow only wants it not to take an anti-Russia position. And Pashinyan came to power in 2018, and during his time in office, Armenia lost a proxy war with Azerbaijan over the latter's right to Nagorno-Karabakh. Pashinyan attempted to fault Moscow for not providing military assistance to Armenia at that time. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian military needs to pull back from the Donbass for peace to move forward. This is what Yuri Ushakov has said. He said that talks between Moscow and Kiev remain stalled until then, and he told Pavel Zarubin, who's a journalist, said that the Ukrainian government already knows this, and they've had several rounds of talks, but they've kind of fallen flat. And according to Ushakov, any new meetings won't change unless Ukrainian troops are withdrawn. And until Ukraine makes the step, one can hold more rounds, dozens of rounds of talks, but will remain in the same spot. Everybody knows in Ukraine that it must be done, and they will do it sooner or later, said the presidential aide. But the U.S. is now more preoccupied with the Middle East, and they are not abandoning the Ukraine issue, and that they're still chatting on this subject, allegedly. So I read a good number of opinion pieces as well, and there was one that I thought was entertaining, I suppose. Well, there were a couple that were pretty entertaining. When the one was called "When the World's Most Powerful Country Has No War Plan." That was interesting. And then another one was Alexander Dugin, and he's the one whose daughter was killed in Ukraine, and he's talking about whites. He's attacking whites. But I wanted to share one, probably all of it, on Nigeria, and then another one on Victory Day with other attacks in other parts of Europe when other parts, and then Trump is angry with Germany. So there's a few of them that I thought about sharing, but I thought the most appropriate would be to talk about Nigeria, because for Nigeria, which is Africa's largest oil producer and one of the most densely populated nations, so the closure of the Hormuz Strait in 2026 has exposed a problem that politicians and technocrats has long preferred to ignore. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most consequential waterways on Earth, and it's only 21 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, that it channels 20% of the world's oil trade. So when the artery is restricted, Brent crude prices surged past 114 a barrel. I was looking at the gas pump today, $4.19, $4.19 at the lake, Lake Ozark, Osage Beach area, $4.19. That's crazy. So we're headed back. Nobody's even bitching about $4 anymore. So beyond crude oil, the closure disrupts the flow of petrochemicals, fertilizers, commodities of other kinds, which are important in the Gulf region and among the world. The disruption deepens global economic strain across trade, prices, finance, threatens food security of important nations from sub-Saharan Africa to Southeast Asia. And Nigeria is one of those countries. So there's Nigeria can't refine its own oil. And one of the problems is the energy story of Nigeria itself. So the nation sits atop some of the world's richest hydrocarbon deposits, and it's for decades has been unable to refine sufficient fuel for its own populations. And Nigerians pay the price through fuel scarcity, suffocating queues at filling stations, and, the economy is perpetually held hostage by the price of imported petroleum. And the Hormuz crisis strips away whatever, normalcy accumulates. And then the commissioning of the Dangote refinery in 2024 was supposed to be optimistic. And with an initial capacity of 650,000 barrels a day, and an ambition to be 1.4 million barrels a day. It was positioned as an answer to Nigeria's chronic refining deficit and its industrial sovereignty. Yet, now it's undermined by a fundamental contradiction. Nigeria's oil, extracted from its own land, is systematically routed away from its own shores. International oil companies operating in the country demonstrate a persistence and a preference for exporting crude to global spot markets rather than supply domestic refineries. And the result is a structural crisis. The refinery, the Dangote refinery, has been compelled to import crude from the U.S. and Africa, a situation that you can't quite believe. It's just a complete policy failure. So the Nigerian National Petroleum Company relies on partial payment in naira and dollars to supply the refinery, has further undermined pricing stability. Aliko Dangote, the president of the Dangote Group, has publicly, complained about the unwillingness to sell crude directly to the refinery, describing the situation as a structural impediment to domestic energy. So when Hormuz crisis pushed global crude prices to $114 a barrel, it's hits them twice. Number one, they got to pay more to get it back from Europe or from other places. U.S. or other places, and then they can't get it through the Hormuz to sell it anyway. So the volatility in the first quarter is for normal Nigerians just means they can't afford anything. And so although Dangote reduced pump prices per liter as crude prices came down, the episode shows that the exposure of Nigerian consumers to full volatility of international markets, and for a population where the majority of livelihoods depend on small trade and informal transportation, a 50% spike in fuel within weeks is a catastrophe. So, and the crude is pledged abroad, so they can't they can't catch a break. Is the point of this story? And so, what can be done? But there's some talk about how to correct it. But one of the largest is, of course, opening the Straits of Hormuz is the short-term answer. Long-term, they have to begin to refine some of their own oil and quit sending it all abroad. And the Straits of Hormuz are making it impossible. And this 2-month delay, now it's starting to go back in their favor. But you never hear these stories in American press, really. So, at any rate, this is here's another one for you on draft enforcers opened fire. The Ukrainian enlistment officers opened fire, shooting at people. And they started firing at them. So Ukrainian enlistment officers opened fire at members of the community who attempted to retrieve a man from a recruitment center in Transcarpathia in the western Ukraine. The incident occurred in the village of Mezhgorye on Saturday after a gang seized a local man, according to Ukrainian journalist Vitaly Glagola. Around 30 people gathered outside the office and tried to force their way inside. The journalist claimed that several shots were fired using a pistol and a Kalashnikov, and he added that officials denied shooting, saying that they'd only shot blank rounds, which, contradicted footage that was shown. And even now, the testimony of the employees doesn't match what they were saying. The confrontation was later confirmed and acknowledged that a group had attempted to break into the military facility and ignored the lawful demands of military. The threat was localized, the attack was repelled, and Boosification is ongoing. And so now you got people attacking recruiting headquarters and being fired upon. Isn't that crazy? That, another attack. They're just everywhere. Well, let's see what else we got here today. Well, there was a story that I don't know if you had heard or if anybody had heard this, but Israel built a base in Iraq to bomb Iran. So the IDF attacked and killed Iraqi troops who discovered Israel's outpost. How about this? So Israel secretly built a military outpost in the Iraqi desert to support its air campaign against Iran and launched strikes on Iraqi troops who discovered it, according to the Wall Street Journal. The base was set up shortly before the U.S. and Israel launched their military campaign against Iran in February. The U.S. was aware of this installation, which housed Israeli special forces and served as a logistics hub for the Israeli Air Force, and it hosted search and rescue teams in case Israeli pilots were shot down. The outpost was nearly exposed in March after a local shepherd noticed unusual military activity, including helicopters, and alerted authorities. Iraqi soldiers moved to investigate the site, but came under heavy fire. The attack left one Iraqi soldier dead and 2 others wounded. Isn't that crazy? Baghdad blames Washington after security forces found evidence that foreign military personnel had been operating in the area. And so it appeared there were certain force on the ground before the strike, supported from the air, operating beyond the capabilities of our units, said Lieutenant General Qash al-Muhammadawi, deputy commander of Iraq's Joint Operations Command. And he told Iraqi state media after the attack in March. This reckless operation was carried out without coordination or approval, and the base reportedly helped Israel fight a long-range war against Iran, whose territory is over 1,600 kilometers, 1,000 miles from Israel. And Israeli aircraft carried out thousands of strikes, while the Iraqi desert outpost gave Israeli teams a forward position closer to the battlefield. The IDF doesn't comment and refused to comment on the latest report, which adds to a growing scrutiny of how Israel's confrontation with Iran has expanded into broader regional conflict and pulling the U.S. deeper inside to the countries and hostilities. Former U.S. counterterrorism chief Joe Kent, who resigned in March, has accused Israel of driving Washington into war, despite U.S. intelligence assessments that Tehran is not actively building a nuclear weapon, which, by the way, is agreed upon by the IAEA. Kent claimed that U.S. agencies had warned Iran would retaliate by targeting American bases and attempting to shut down the Straits of Hormuz if attacked, and he argued that the Israeli narrative about Iranian threat ultimately won the argument in Washington and forced the U.S. into the conflict. Trump officials have denied that Israel dragged Washington into the war. Put me in coach, U.S. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth said earlier this week that President Donald Trump acted based on America's interest and his America First policy, and he dismissed the idea that Prime Minister Netanyahu pulled the U.S. into the conflict. He calls it a false premise. Isn't that crazy? Earlier I was talking to you about the anniversary of the 81st anniversary of Germany's surrender and how it became one of the chief celebrations in Russia. And I wanted to share this with you because people wonder about that. Now, I say it's because of how much the war and the conflict, World War II, touched every family. And, sometimes it takes a couple, 3 generations to get past it. And most, if not all, people who fought during that war in the 40s, the people that were born in the 40s would be in their 80s now, right? And so the people who fought would be at age 100, and there's still a couple, that have appeared and whatnot at victory days and stuff like that. I didn't get to watch any of the footage from I saw a few pictures, but I didn't get to watch any of the parade. I heard Putin's speech, but I didn't watch a whole lot of the parade go through. But World War II's Victory Day, celebrated in Russia on May 9th, is a very special holiday. It was the greatest trial and the greatest triumph in Russians' modern history. But the celebrations have acquired their current shape and form not all that long ago, and some important traditions were established fairly recently. The act of unconditional surrender of the German Third Reich was signed by Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel on May 8, 1945, at 10:43 p.m. Central European Time. So in Moscow, it was already the early hours of May the 9th. That very morning, Russians found out that the war, which had claimed 27 million Soviet lives, was over and the enemy had surrendered. The first celebration of victory in World War II, or as Russia calls it, the Great Patriotic War, took place that very day. Army reports dropped their official tone and described how the residents of Prague pulled the troops off their armored vehicles and danced and drank together. In the provinces, people ran out onto the streets and congratulated each other. Indeed, some fanatical Nazis continued to put up some resistance. Europe was full of mines, and reports stated that there were many losses throughout the month of May. But the big war was over, and to the sound of fireworks, people began returning home. No one doubted that victory in World War II was an incredible event, but people were grieving the deaths of relatives and friends, and their pain was great. May 9 was immediately designated a national holiday, but lavish celebrations seemed out of place as the country was in ruins, and mentally and physically crippled soldiers, concentration camp prisoners, Osterbiters, and refugees returned home. In western Ukraine and the Baltic states, battles against nationalist partisans continued. In those years, Victory Day parade was held once, in the summer of 1945. During this spectacle, the Wehrmacht and SS banners seized in Germany were thrown in front of the Kremlin, but in the following years, the celebration became more modest. But every year on May 9th, there was a fireworks display, but otherwise, from 1947, it was a regular work day, even though a festive one, and veterans usually celebrated with friends. Things changed in 1965. By that time, 20 years had passed since the end of the war, and new Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev, who himself was a World War II veteran, decided to once again make May 9 a day off. From then on, military parades were held on Victory Day. On Jubilees, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier Memorial was opened on the Kremlin wall. The tradition of laying wreaths at the memorials was established. In short, the holiday acquired a grand scale and became quite solemn after the nation's pain had somewhat subsided. The country is gone, but the memory remains. The annual large-scale celebration of Victory Day, with parades held across the country and a military parade on Red Square, is a fairly new tradition. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, an obvious question arose. What would be done with the country's communist legacy and symbology? For example, the day of the 1917 revolution was observed on November 7. It was replaced by another holiday associated with Russian national heroes Minin and Pozharsky, who lived in the 17th century, but no one ever considered revising May 9th as Victory Day. However, the authorities wanted to separate the holiday from socialist ideology. In the Soviet Union, ideology and victory were inseparable, but in the 90s, a new era came about. The USSR was gone. Many war heroes fell prey in new conflicts. For example, Vladimir Bochkovsky, a hero of the battle in Ukraine and Germany, became a citizen of the unrecognized Republic of Transnistria, which started a bloody uprising against the former Soviet Republic of Moldova. Meliton Kantaria, the standard-bearer who had hoisted the Soviet flag over the Reichstag, was forced to flee from Abkhazia when an ethnic conflict broke out between Abkhazians and Georgians, even though by that time he was a very old man. So at that time, a question arose. What does Victory Day mean in the new republics? Opinions differed. In Baltic states, national elites believed that in the 40s their countries had been held hostage by two totalitarian regimes. Moreover, unofficially, the Nazis were preferred over the communists. For example, in Latvia, the Memorial Day of the Latvian SS Legion is celebrated for some time. In many other USSR republics, Victory Day is still celebrated in one way or another. In Russia, Victory Day has remained one of the most important national holidays and a key moment in Russian history, but the holiday has lost some of its political meaning. For example, Lenin's mausoleum is draped on May 9 in order to avoid ideological ties. And a new symbol has been added to the celebrations, the black and orange St. George ribbon, which resembles both the ribbon of the Order of St. George, the highest military decoration in Imperial Russia, and the ribbon of the Order of Glory, a World War II soldier's award. Russian communists and leftists did not like the fact that Soviet symbols were replaced. But for the majority of Russian people, other aspects turn out to be more important. World War II impacted almost every family in Russia. And most people consider the Soviet era as simply one period in the country's history. Therefore, national motives are considered far more important than Soviet symbology. However, an even more pressing question was how Victory Day would look and what it would mean following the death of most war veterans. World War II was mainly won by people who were born in the 1900 to 1920s. The last generation which really participated in the war was born in 1926. By 2010, those veterans were already 85 years old, and today, most Russians do not personally know anyone who fought in World War II. So the answer to the question, what to do next, was found, and it was offered not by the state, but by the people. An old holiday celebrated in a new way. In 2012, 3 journalists from the provincial city of Tomsk organized a street march. The descendants of veterans marched through the city, bearing photos of their deceased relatives who had fought in World War II. The event was dubbed the Immortal Regiment, and that year 6,000 people participated in the march on May 9. And while for these people the war was no longer a part of their own lives, it remained a part of their family history. After all, everyone had a grandfather or grandmother who fought, and if the word great-grandfather sounded abstract to many, my grandmother's father felt much more personal. The idea of marching with the photographs of their heroic ancestors appealed to people all over Russia, and the very next year, the Immortal Regiment events were held in almost all the major cities of Russia. The march instantly became a Victory Day tradition, and the event gained official status. An online offshoot of the Immortal Regiment also appeared, a platform where anyone can publish information about their ancestors who fought in World War II. The number of such records on the website is approaching 1 million, and so May 9th has acquired a new meaning. It became not only a veterans' holiday or a celebration of military triumph, but a memorial march which allows people to honor their personal family history. Some of the photos in this story are just incredible. It shows how crowded it was, and people walking with photos of their family. Each country has its own memorable dates. For example, July the 4th brings Americans together, but for the rest of the world, it's just another day. For China, October 1, the day of the formation of the People's Republic of China, is one of the main dates in its history. For Russia, May 9th is a date that is permanently ingrained in the country's history and culture. During World War II, the people of the country, along with those of other USSR republics, survived a meat grinder that lasted 4 years. They did not allow themselves to be broken, but defeated the enemy, and then proceeded to rebuild their country from the ruins. Russia lost a huge amount of people in World War II, and victory came at an unthinkable price, but it was unconditional. That is why, for Russians, May the 9th isn't just a celebration of a military triumph. It is a celebration of victory over death. So that story or article was written by a guy named Yevgeny Norin, who's a Russian journalist and historian focused on war and conflict in the former Soviet Union. And, that's kind of interesting. I remember seeing those Red Square parades when I was in the military myself as a young man and watching them. And seeing them today, they're still pretty, pretty powerful, and they put a lot out there. But you wonder how they, how that tradition evolved. I guess would be the right word. Evolved over the years. Let's see. We're gonna talk about the Prime Minister Fico. Remember, he was in Moscow, and he attended Victory Day. He described a new Iron Curtain between the EU and Russia and called for restoration of dialogue with Russia instead of continuous hatred. He's been pretty vocal about this kind of thing. And he described himself as one of EU's black sheep over his stance on Russia. And he's the only sitting EU leader to travel to Moscow for Victory Day and to meet with President Putin. And he drew harsh criticism from Brussels and several member states. In a video statement posted on Facebook on Saturday, Fico accused the EU of downplaying the Soviet Union's role in defeating Nazi Germany. And he was on board the Slovakian government jet returning from Moscow. He warned that Brussels' Russia policy was damaging the bloc's competitiveness and energy security. He also shared some footage of his visit. He said, also, I reject a new Iron Curtain between the European Union and Russia. We are interested in standard, friendly, and mutually beneficial relations with this world power. By the way, it's they say, Merz said that there's going to be some repercussions for this. And Brussels, Germany, what are they going to do? They're going to, attack their gas through the pipeline. So Druzhba's reopened, and Magyar, who took over for Orban in Hungary, has, now they're going to be pressuring him, because this is what they did to him. Remember, he collected all that money, which they wouldn't give to the prior leader of Hungary, Orban, and they wouldn't give it to him. And now they're going to do. Now it's going to be they're going to be exactly the same thing that they do to Fico, to try to destroy him and try to get him thrown out. And they're already pushing and advertising that sort of thing. But Fico argued that the EU is making a huge mistake by relying on sanctions and military support for Ukraine instead of talking, doing some sort of diplomacy with Moscow. He said his talks in the Kremlin focused on energy cooperation. He accuses the EU of pursuing ideological policy of cutting off Russian energy supplies at the expense of European competitiveness. And he said, we cannot, just out of hatred for Russia, replace one energy dependence with another, this time American, he argued. According to energy data, the U.S. supplied more than half of the bloc's LNG imports in 2025. And European Commission reportedly removed a proposal to fully phase out Russian oil from its near-term agenda amid concerns that the Iran war and continuing disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz would cause further fuel prices and destabilize Europe's energy supply. Isn't that terrible? Well, this is the point where I would normally provide a song, and a break. But I'm going to proceed. What I wanted to do next was Putin gave, after the Victory Day, he gave a press conference. And so this is pretty recent. And so he wanted to, the journalist wanted to question him over several things. And there's a journalist named Lana Samsonia. She's from Interfax. And she talked about Victory Day, Trump's ceasefire proposal, security measures. She wanted to talk about the overall assessment of the conduct of Victory Day, especially in light of President Trump's initiative for a 3-day ceasefire. Kiev's provocative statements before May 9 and the fact that the parade was held in a reduced format because of security concerns. And so Putin was a little bit cautious, and he said he was physically at the Ministry of Defense and had not yet received any military report about any provocations, but he explained that Russia had already decided to hold the Victory Day ceremonies without a display of military equipment, not only for security reasons, but because the armed forces should remain focused on the military operation. He said Russia responded to Kiev's threatened statements through the Defense Ministry and the Foreign Ministry. And, he talked about these emphasizing that Russia, was still planning on taking retaliatory strikes, and he stated that they had already warned and talked to partners, including China, India, United States, other centers in Kiev. He still hasn't ruled that out, and he had already proposed exchanging 500 servicemen, but Ukraine, we're going to exchange some prisoners. But his bottom line was that Russia supported the U.S.'s humanitarian proposal. And another one was a guy named, it doesn't matter what the names of these journalists are, I suppose. And he talked about Armenia being absent, and the bilateral meetings with Armenia that we talked about a little bit here previously. And he asked about Armenia being absent from the parade, especially given that Armenian Prime Minister hosted Zelensky and allowed him to, talk about those anti-Russian statements. And Putin said the main subject of the meeting was Victory Day itself, the shared victory over Nazism, preservation of the historical memory, and the need to prevent anything similar from happening again. And he shifted into practical matters, and he emphasized Russia's relations with Belarus, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Laos, highlighted the scale of trade with Belarus, the growth of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, importance of the Southeast Asia. On Armenia, he said that there were no invitations that had been formally sent, because this wasn't one of the Jubilee events, like every 5 years, 10 years, anything like that, like last year's was. So it shouldn't be overemphasized that they weren't here this time. And he praised certain leaders that came anyways, Fico. And he said, he talked about Armenia's move toward the European Union. He actually was pretty strategic here. He said Russia would support whatever is genuinely beneficial to Armenia and Armenian people, but that Armenia must calculate the economic consequences. He said Armenia receives significant benefits through Eurasian economic arrangements, and that Russia-Armenia trade is a large, especially relative to Armenia's GDP. And Putin suggested that a referendum would be a logical way for Armenia to decide its future direction. And if Armenia chooses the EU, then Russia would seek a mutually beneficial divorce, is how he put it. He said a soft, intelligent, mutually beneficial divorce. When I practiced law, I used to say stuff like that. The divorce needs to be, you guys need to be adults about this. And, with the people who play games, man, I was never interested in that. I just want to screw that so-and-so over. Oh, my God, I hated to hear that stuff. Anyway, he also used Ukraine as a warning, an example, and he argued that Ukraine's first move toward the EU created a practical trade and regulatory problems involved customs, agriculture, industrial goods, and in Putin's statements, European rigidity over these issues contributed to today's political crisis. Certainly the Maidan coup, Crimea, southeast Ukraine resistance, and ultimately war, and his message to Armenia is clear: decide, calculate, and try not to drift into a crisis, is basically what he was saying. Let's see. A guy from a magazine called Commemorations, he asked why Putin was silent when Zelensky responded to Russia's May 8th ceasefire by announcing a ceasefire to begin on May 6th. He asked also whether Slovak Prime Minister Fico had delivered a message from Zelensky to him and whether Putin had to force himself to deal with Zelensky. And Putin said that he described his phone conversation with Trump, saying Trump spoke respectfully about the shared Allied struggle against Nazism and supported the idea of a ceasefire surrounding May 9. And he said that Russia had announced May 8 and 9 and had received no immediate reaction, and then Kiev later gave its own May 6 proposal because it didn't want to simply accept what Russia offered. Putin framed Kiev's conduct as gamesmanship and contrasted it with Russia's view of May 9 as a pretty much a sacred day tied to the enormous Soviet and Russian losses in World War II. He said that Russia was not playing games with Victory Day. They just wouldn't do it. And he said that Russia had proposed a prisoner exchange on May 5, including 500 Ukrainian servicemen, and welcomed Trump's exchange proposal. But on the question of meeting Zelensky, Putin said he wasn't going to refuse to meet with him just on the basis of principle, but he said anyone who wants to meet may come to Moscow, and that a meeting in a third country would also be possible, but only when specialists have already finalized a durable peace agreement ready for signature. And Putin argued that high-level negotiation without prior substantive agreement are usually pointless. And he cited his own experience with Minsk, the Minsk process, where leaders would talk day and night and no result. And notably, Putin doesn't appear to give a direct confirmation or denial about whether Fico delivered a message from Zelensky to him. So he wanted to know, another journalist wanted to ask about how Putin continues to view Ukrainian settlement efforts involving the United States, especially given that negotiations had stalled after, contacts, and Marco Rubio suggested it's not worth spending time on the process. Remember that from several weeks ago, where Rubio says it's just a waste of everybody's time. Well, Putin's response was short, and he said the conflict is a matter between Russia and Ukraine. If others want to help, Russia welcomes that help. But he said that the current U.S. administration and Trump appear interested in settlement, and he emphasized that the U.S. has other priorities and does not need this conflict. So Putin said that Russia is grateful for such efforts, but he returned to the central point. The core settlement issue is between Russia and Ukraine. Another journalist asked him about long-range attacks inside of Russia and whether the West has gone too far. And he said that the terrorist threat from the Kiev regime is growing. He cited attacks far from the border in places such as Yekaterinburg, Perm, Cheboksary, and the question asked about whether the West has allowed itself too much, since Western officials themselves acknowledge that Kiev couldn't continue the war for long without outside support. And Putin said that he defines the West more narrowly as the globalist wing of Western elites, which he said Russia, is fighting Russia with the hands of the Ukrainians. And he said the conflict was provoked by Western disregard for Russian interests and by using Ukraine as a geopolitical instrument. And so he returned to NATO expansionism, saying Russia has been deceived since the early 90s. I thought that was important when he said that. And he said that, talking about NATO expansion and the deception that surrounded it was one of the more blunt things that he has said. Now, he said it before, but usually he's a little more diplomatic. And this one, he's just like, well, they, basically pulled the wool over our eyes and by claiming they weren't going to, and then they did. Then he revisited the 2022 Istanbul negotiations and talked about how they had already initialed an agreement, and then Western leaders intervened. He said Macron told him that Ukraine wouldn't sign a historic agreement with a pistol to its temple, after which Russia withdrew forces from near Kiev. Now that part I hadn't heard before, where Macron told him that Ukraine wouldn't sign an agreement with a pistol to its temple, because people were wondering. Remember, Russia was already inside of Kiev, or very, very close to it, and Macron told him, all right, well, they're not going to sign an agreement with a pistol with a gun to their head. And so Russia withdrew its forces from Kiev. And then Boris Johnson came to Kiev and said, they weren't going to sign anyway. Convinced him to not sign anyway. And Putin used this as continuing evidence that the West is prolonging and has prolonged this conflict. And he said Western elites expected Russia to collapse in months, but that it didn't happen, and it's left them stuck in a confrontation they cannot exit. And then he added that, sensible political force still does exist in Europe, and he expressed the hope that such forces will gain influence or possibly even return to power. And then he also said something about the U.S. and Iran, and he described it as difficult for Russia because Moscow has good relations with Iran and friendly relations with the Gulf. And he said Russia remains in contact with both sides and hopes the confrontation will be stopped quickly. And his warning was blunt that if the escalation, continues, everybody loses. And he said, another journalist asked about the coalition of the willing. He said that there may be another coalition emerging that wants to restore contact with Russia. And this journalist said that the head of the European Council mentioned the search for a person to represent them and asked Putin who he would prefer and whether any rational politicians remain in Western Europe. That was a great question, by the way. And Putin said that personally he'd prefer German Chancellor, the former German Chancellor, Gerhard Schroeder. And beyond that, he said Europeans should choose a leader they trust and one who has not said nasty things about Russia. His broader point is that Russia has never closed the door, and Russia has never refused talks. Europe has. And this was very interesting to hear him speak, because there was a lot of wartime rhetoric going on here, a lot of I don't know, these questions were pretty pointed, in attacking. And this next one was a pretty big one about Baltic airspace. There was a woman who asked about Baltic region becoming a corridor for Ukrainian drones and about drones being used against Russia that were assembled from factories in Europe. She asked what Russia is going to do with this information and whether the security zone Russia is creating near its borders needs to be expanded all the way to Ukraine's western border. So that was pretty interesting question. Obviously a smart-ass question. And Putin's answer was short, but pretty wide-reaching. He said that the journalist had answered her own question, that Russia must make sure that no one can threaten it. And he said that is what Russia has been seeking to achieve. He said that Europe supplies technology and that equipment is partially assembled there, and he calls this an unprecedented escalation. But he said Europe now appears to be seeking contact with Russia because that it understands, maybe finally, that raising the stakes is proving far more costly. Then there was a question about Iranian enriched uranium and Russia's proposed mediation, and it talks about Iran's nuclear program, enriched uranium, and Putin said Russia had already played this type of role in 2015, and that Iran trusts Russia because Moscow doesn't violate its agreements and continues peaceful nuclear cooperation with Iran, including the Bushehr nuclear project. Putin said Russia had offered to repeat that model, and Iran could transfer enriched uranium to Russia, and it could be handled transparently and under the IAEA. And he said that at first the U.S., Iran, and Israel all agreed on this. And then the U.S. hardened its position and demanded the material be exported only to the U.S. Iran said no and refused to export the uranium anywhere. And Putin said Iran has proposed a different format, joint ventures on Iranian territory to dilute uranium inside Iran, and Russia was not opposed if it could de-escalate. But Putin said the United States and Israel wouldn't accept that, and he says the track is deadlocked. And he insists that Russian proposal remains on the table because it would allow Iran to transfer material to a friendly country, keep peaceful nuclear cooperation intact, and place that process under the IAEA and reduce tension without Russia seeking, some sort of leverage. And he said Russia would support any solution that broke the deadlock. And that would be, worthwhile. Now, there's I think it's coming up, the preparations for Trump. Obviously Trump and Xi Jinping are supposed to meet in China here before too long, but wanted to know, because Putin's visit to China is coming up as well. And so a reporter asked whether there's any connection between the two visits. And she asked what key issues Putin is wanting to discuss with Xi, and Putin answered that Russia-China cooperation is one of the most important stabilizing factors in international relations, because many security, disarmament, and nuclear arms agreements have either collapsed or disappeared. And he said China is Russia's largest trade partner. He says that about $140 billion a year, and he says it continues to grow and diversify, especially in the high technology sectors. And he thanks Xi Jinping personally for supporting the diversification of late. And then he listed major areas of cooperation in nuclear energy, alternative energy, space, traditional energy, oil, and gas. He said Russia and China are close to agreement on a major step forward in oil and gas cooperation, but he didn't give any details. And I wonder if this is Severny Patok 2. Not Severny Patok, Put Siberia, something like that. It's Siberia 2, Road to Siberia or something like that. And it goes through Mongolia and so into China. And they were trying to talk about that. And I wonder, we've spoken about that several times before, and I wonder if that one is finally they have some news regarding that. So regarding Trump's visit, and with Xi Jinping that's allegedly coming up, Putin welcomes such talks, and he calls them another stabilizing element because the U.S. and China trade relations affect the whole world. He said Russia hopes there will be no illegitimate sanctions or unnecessary economic tension between the two powers. And his view was that stable and constructive U.S. relations tend to benefit Russia. So I thought that was an interesting perspective. Let's see. A reporter from RIA Novosti asked about the historical memory, asked why Europe now avoids mentioning heroism of Soviet soldiers and even bans St. George ribbons. She asked whether this trend will worsen and what Russia can do about it. And Putin answered that the stronger Russia becomes, the faster this behavior will disappear. And he said that Europe's treatment of Soviet memory as a form of re-entrenchment by the same globalist Western elites that he already criticized earlier in the briefing. He argued that those elites expected Russia to collapse within 6 months under sanctions, factories would be stopped, banks would be broken, and millions unemployed. Instead, he said Russia has maintained very low unemployment and has avoided the collapse the Western elites expected. And that just hasn't happened. And so he then suggested that some European actors hoped to grab something from Russia if it had weakened. Now, I've talked about this before, too, that a bunch of the globalist elites, all they had ever really wanted was for Russia to collapse so that they could part it out. And Ukraine could steal a bunch, Finland could grab some, the pre-Baltic could get some, and then, of course, the U.S. through, investment and things like that could split a bunch of it up as well, at least in the influence level, but that's not what happened. He said that Finland's NATO accession was also a problem, and there were no territorial disputes with Finland, and there just haven't been any, and that Finnish leaders knew this, and he implied the move was motivated by opportunistic forces rather than real defense. He said Europe is now beginning to realize that Russia's not just going to collapse, and that it might be better to seek a return to normal relations and mutually acceptable arrangements instead of lopsided pro-Western ones. And he said that Russia has always dealt with Europe on a basis of mutual respect and consideration of its interests, even if Europe did not do the same. And his closing point was that relations with many European countries can eventually be restored, and that the sooner that happens, the better it will be for both Russia and Europe. And he, of course, finished the press conference by wishing everyone a happy Victory Day. I saw a very interesting interview of a guy, well, I guess more of a conversation. Well, I suppose what else would a good interview be but a good conversation with a guy named Sergei Karaganov. And he isn't just some you know, I don't know, blogger. You know, he's a Russian foreign policy intellectual, and he's got deep Soviet, post-Soviet academic and other credentials. And he isn't speaking as an official Kremlin guy, but he is speaking from inside of Russia, in their strategic, intellectual framework. You know, he's an important person, and his argument helped explain why Moscow increasingly believes that old Western, escalate, but assume Russia will just bend over and take it. You know, that model is gone. Sergei Alexandrovich Karaganov is one of Russia's most influential foreign policy and security thinkers. He's not military field command. He's a strategic analyst, foreign policy, security doctrine, elite advisory work. The university lists him as a graduate of Moscow State University Department of Economics in 1974, doctoral work at the Institute of USA and Canada Studies, and a research trainee where he worked at the Soviet UN mission in 1976 and 1977. He gave a 1979 dissertation on transnational corporations in U.S. foreign policy. He worked at the Institute of USA and Canadian Studies about U.S. and Soviet relationships, U.S. military strategy, arms control, and European security. His resume is institutional heavy, and since 1991, he's been a member of the Scientific Advisory Council of the Russian Foreign Ministry from 1993 to 1999. He served on the Presidential Council of the Russian Federation. Since 1993, he's been on the Advisory Committee of the Russian Security Council. From 2001 to 2013, he was an advisor to the Presidential Administration on Foreign Policy, and he's also been tied to the Council on Foreign and Defense Policy since 1992, and he's honorary chairman of the Presidium. Academically, he helped build the Higher School of Economic Faculty of World Economy and International Affairs, and he created and headed that faculty for more than 15 years. So he's kind of a powerhouse in there. He's not the Kremlin, he's more intellectual think tank inside of Russia. And he was asked about the developments that had been nearly unthinkable during the Cold War. NATO countries assisting with missile attacks on Russia, and they backed the Kursk incursion, assisted attacks on Russian nuclear triad and early warning systems. And the underlying question just isn't what's happening in Ukraine, it's whether NATO has crossed a red line without seriously even discussing Russian security concerns. And Karaganov answers pretty severely. He says Russia has procrastinated too long, tolerated Western aggression in the hope that some negotiated solution would be found. In his view, this hope is absolutely exhausted, and he argues that Russia must now escalate and punish European enemies because they are conducting all-out war against Russia. And he calls the conflict a world war, either the third or the fourth one, and he says Ukraine is only the opening theater. Now that is a little bit frightening, and the deeper issue in his view is the systematic transformation of the world order from Western dominance toward multipolarity. Why does this matter? Because Karaganov isn't trying to move the discussion away from Ukraine war and toward world system war. That's matters because if Moscow accepts this framing, then the battle isn't limited to Donbass, Crimea, Kharkov, Kursk. It's Europe, it's Middle East, it's South Asia, global finance, everything that I've been talking about for a year and a half. And so in old-fashioned terms, once you define a changed system, everything connected to it is warring. And that's, pretty powerful, especially when Europe is already saying that war is coming by 2030 anyway. And Karaganov says that Russia has to win for two reasons. He says that Russia must win first to stop the bloodletting in Ukraine, which he says is endless. And second, he says that Russia has to prevent horizontal escalation, which means the spread of destabilization beyond Ukraine into South Eurasia, Middle East, North Africa, and Southeast Asia. He argues that the Iran issue isn't really about Iranian nuclear weapons, but about destabilizing a vast region from the Maghreb towards Southeast Asia. Now that's frightening. And from Karaganov's point of view, Ukraine is an intermediate battlefield, but the larger war is over the future architecture of Eurasia. And he sees American Western strategy as an effort to destabilize the southern belt of Eurasia to preserve Western dominance. And why does this matter? Because he's not saying that Russia has to defeat Ukraine. He says that Russia has to prevent a larger Western destabilization project from spreading across Eurasia. And whether you agree or disagree, that's the architecture of the argument. And by the way, that's a common theme. I say the same thing. This war, these 2-3 wars, they're all about one. They're not about politics. These are about resources. It's all about, what has Trump done? Trump has done, he's all about resources. He made no bones about it. It's he wants to dominate the Western Hemisphere. He wants to keep dollar hegemony. And he's pushing that all the way over into Iran. And if it wasn't for him trying to dictate what Russia and China will do, I might not believe this, and if it wasn't for him being so resource heavy, it's possible that my thoughts would change in this matter. But I continue to see it as vital. I don't know if you remember when I first said I was going to go over to the BRICS conference and learn about what was coming here. Well, BRICS wasn't all about economics. BRICS is about a changing world. And I believe these wars are about a changing world too. And Karaganov was a pretty similar thought process on these world wars aren't really about politics. They're about keeping the same old, hegemony that was there before. One size fits all, and it's Western only, Then he got into a little bit about nuclear escalation. Because Karaganov had said something in the interview about whether nuclear weapons should ever be used. And what he said was that war has benefited Russia socially and spiritually by forcing the country to recover its soul and its honor and value real meritocracy, soldiers, doctors, scholars, officers. But he says Russia is paying too high a price in human lives, and his proposed solution is to climb the escalation ladder. Conventional strikes on symbolic or logistic points in Europe, and then if Europe doesn't back down, nuclear strikes. And he says he's not calling for a massive nuclear war, and he says that he hopes it's not necessary. But this was somewhat alarming. But he says that European elites have all lost their minds and their sense of history, and the Russian nuclear doctrine should be rewritten not only to deter attacks on Russia, but to punish European elites, including their hardened command structures. And Reuters reported in 2024 that Karaganov was urging Russia to adopt a more assertive nuclear posture back then. I remember sharing that with you, and that he viewed the existing nuclear doctrine as inadequate because it didn't convince adversaries that Russia might actually use nuclear weapons. Remember that? This is Karaganov believes deterrence has failed anyway because the West no longer fears Russia enough. And his answer isn't diplomacy first, it's fear first. In his view, the purpose of nuclear escalation isn't apocalypse, but compelling people to do things, forcing Europe elites to stop doing what they're doing. So Karaganov is arguing that nuclear weapons are politically useless if the enemy assumes you will never use them. Now, everybody else argues that, it's not us that's ever used them, it's only the United States. So if anybody's crazy out there, it's the Americans, right? But that's not what Karaganov says. He says, if we have to use them first, maybe we have to. So he says that his view is no longer the minority view, but the majority. He says that historic West is losing cultural, political, economic predominance that allowed it to dominate and exploit the world for centuries. And he portrays the present crisis as a Western effort to reverse that decline. And he's not reassured by changes in U.S. administrations. He doesn't even see the problem as Biden versus Trump, Democrat versus Republican, anything like that. Just same people, same platforms, different people, basically. And he says the spirit of Alaska has to be dismissed as a joke, He talked a little bit about arms control, but it doesn't look like I'm going to have time to give that to you today. We'll have to continue that theme tomorrow. I'm going to be traveling, so it's going to be a possibility of doing it live and a possibility of pre-recorded like this one. I hope you enjoy it. I hope you join me every day on Damn Radio and International Flavor here at damradio.com/live or at any time at internationalflavor.com. Thanks for being here this evening.